Hey guys, welcome to Sleeping Stone Whispers, the place where quiet history gently drifts through the night. Tonight's story explores the slow and surprisingly peaceful history of pets, from the first wolf sitting beside ancient campfires to the calm companionship of animals in modern homes. We'll wander through ancient villages, royal palaces, medieval towns, and early cities to see how humans slowly learned to live with animals. Along the way, we'll discover curious laws about pets, strange traditions of adoption, and the quiet ways people cared for their animal companions long ago. If you enjoy calm, sleepy history like this, please like the video and subscribe to Sleeping Stone Whispers so you don't miss our next gentle journey into the past. And before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight and whether you're listening to relax, study, or drift off to sleep. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let the quiet story begin. Long before cities existed, before written laws, and long before people spoke of pets, humans and animals were already living quiet lives beside one another. It was not a sudden friendship. It did not happen quickly. Instead, it happened slowly, almost silently, over many thousands of years. Imagine a cold evening somewhere in the distant past. A small group of early humans sits around a fire. The flames move gently, sending sparks upward into the dark sky. Around them are simple tools made of stone and wood. The people speak softly, sharing food and warmth after a long day of searching for plants and hunting small animals. Beyond the circle of firelight, the wilderness stretches in every direction. Tall grasses sway in the night wind. Trees creak softly. And somewhere, hidden in the darkness, a pair of watchful eyes observes the humans. These eyes likely belong to wolves. At this time in history, wolves were not pets. They were wild animals, skilled hunters, moving through forests and plains in careful packs. Humans and wolves were not enemies exactly, but they were certainly not friends either. Both species hunted similar animals. Both competed for food. Both were cautious of one another. But something interesting slowly began to happen. Human camps produced leftovers. After a hunt, bones remained. Small scraps of meat were sometimes left behind near the fire. These scraps created opportunities for animals brave enough to approach. The boldest wolves may have come first. Perhaps one curious wolf wandered close to a human camp late at night. The people inside the camp might have heard the soft movement in the grass. Maybe they watched carefully as the animal approached, sniffing the air, stepping cautiously toward a discarded bone. The wolf would not stay long. It would grab the bone and disappear quickly into the dark. For many nights, nothing more happened. But slowly, something changed. A few wolves discovered that human camps could be useful places. Food sometimes appeared there. And humans, unlike larger predators, often stayed in one place for a while. Camps became predictable sources of scraps. So wolves began returning. At first, they stayed far away, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Over time, however, the bravest wolves came a little closer. Humans noticed them, of course. Some may have thrown stones or shouted to scare them away. Others may have simply ignored them. After all, wolves also provided a small benefit. Their presence around the camp could scare away other animals. Strange predators might hesitate before approaching a place already watched by wolves. In this quiet and accidental way, both species began to tolerate one another. This was not friendship yet. It was simply coexistence. Over many generations, the wolves that stayed near human camps slowly changed. The most aggressive wolves avoided people and remained deep in the wilderness. But the calmer, more curious wolves sometimes lingered near the edges of camps. Those calmer wolves survived well. They had access to scraps of food. They did not need to hunt as often. And gradually, their offspring inherited their slightly calmer nature. Humans were changing too. People began to recognize certain animals that appeared repeatedly near their camps. A wolf that had been seen many times might no longer seem like a stranger. Some individuals may have even begun leaving bones intentionally at the edge of the camp. It is difficult to know exactly when the first true moment of trust occurred. Perhaps it happened on a quiet morning when a wolf did not run away immediately. Perhaps it happened when a young animal, curious and hungry, came just a little too close to the fire. Or perhaps it happened when humans noticed that certain wolves barked or growled when strangers approached. Little by little, a new relationship formed. Some wolves began following human groups as they moved across the land. They walked at a distance at first, trailing behind the camps. Over time, the distance grew smaller. These animals were not quite wolves anymore. But they were not yet the dogs we know today either. They lived somewhere in between. Archaeologists today sometimes find ancient burial sites where humans and dogs were buried near one another. These discoveries suggest that the connection between humans and their earliest animal companions may be much older than we once believed. In some places, dogs were buried carefully beside their human partners. This suggests something remarkable. The relationship had become emotional. But that moment was still far in the future. For now, in the quiet ancient world, the first steps toward companionship were still unfolding. Wolves circled the edges of firelight. Humans watched them with curiosity and caution. Neither side fully trusted the other. Yet night after night, the distance between them grew smaller. The fire crackled softly. The stars drifted slowly across the sky. And somewhere just beyond the circle of light, the earliest ancestors of our modern pets waited patiently, slowly becoming part of the human story. As many years passed, the quiet relationship between humans and certain animals began to change in small, gradual ways. No one at the time would have used the word domestication. In fact, early humans likely did not think of it as a special process at all. To them, it was simply a normal part of life slowly unfolding. The animals that stayed near human camps were usually the ones that were less fearful and less aggressive. Wolves that easily panicked or attacked humans rarely stayed long. But calmer animals, the curious ones who did not run away immediately, found it easier to survive near people. Generation after generation, this small difference slowly shaped the animals themselves. The wolves that lingered near humans began to change. Their behavior became a little more relaxed around people. Their bodies slowly adapted as well. Some became smaller than their wild ancestors. Others developed softer features and more varied coat colors. These changes did not happen quickly. In fact, they happened so slowly that no single person would have noticed the transformation during their lifetime. It took hundreds, perhaps thousands, of years. During this time, humans also began noticing that certain animals could be helpful. Dogs, for example, proved useful during hunts. Their strong sense of smell helped track animals. Their barking could alert people to danger. Even their presence at night provided a small feeling of security around the campfire. But usefulness was only part of the story. Sometimes animals simply stayed because they had grown used to humans. Puppies born near human camps might grow up seeing people as a normal part of their world. They learned the sounds of human voices, the smell of smoke from fires, and the rhythm of daily life in the camp. Children in these camps may have played near these young animals. They might have fed them scraps of food or watched them grow. Over time, the animals became familiar companions rather than distant visitors. This slow and quiet change marked the true beginning of domestication. Animals were no longer simply wild creatures passing by. They were beginning to live alongside humans in a more permanent way. And although early humans may not have realized it, a new chapter in the relationship between people and animals had quietly begun, one that would eventually lead to the many beloved pets that share our homes today. As humans slowly moved from wandering life to farming villages, daily routines became more settled and organized. People began building small homes, planting crops, and staying in one place for many seasons. With this quieter and more stable way of living, animals also became a regular part of village life. Dogs were often the most common companions. They guarded homes, barked at strangers, and sometimes helped during hunts. Cats, in many places, quietly appeared as well, drawn by the presence of grain stores and the small animals that gathered around them. But as animals became more common in villages, a simple question slowly began to appear. Who did the animal belong to? In small communities where everyone lived close together, this question was not always easy to answer. A dog might sleep near one house but wander freely through the entire village during the day. Cats, even more independent, might move between several homes, hunting mice wherever they pleased. Because of this, early ideas of ownership were often flexible. Sometimes an animal was considered part of a family simply because it returned to that home each night. Other times, the person who fed the animal most often was seen as its caretaker. Disagreements occasionally happened. If two families both claimed the same dog, elders in the village might settle the matter by discussing who had raised the animal as a puppy, or who had cared for it during illness or injury. These early discussions slowly shaped the first simple rules about animals. In some farming communities, animals that helped protect crops or food storage were especially valued. A good cat that hunted mice in a grain store might be welcomed by the entire village, rather than owned by one household. In these cases, the animal belonged, in a sense, to everyone. Dogs, however, were more often linked to individual families. A dog that guarded a specific home or followed a particular person during work in the fields gradually became known as that person's animal. These were not formal laws written on paper or carved into stone. Instead, they were quiet agreements shaped by daily life and shared understanding. Over time, these simple village customs laid the foundation for something much larger. They were the earliest steps toward the idea that animals could belong to people, not just as wild creatures passing nearby, but as companions with a place in human communities. As human civilizations grew larger and more organized, animals began to take on new roles in daily life. One of the most fascinating examples of this can be found in the ancient civilization of Egypt, where cats were treated with an unusual level of respect and protection. Long ago, along the calm banks of the Nile River, Egyptian towns and villages depended heavily on storing grain. Wheat and barley were carefully kept in large storage buildings so people would have enough food throughout the year. But where grain was stored, mice and rats often followed. This is where cats quietly became very important. Cats were excellent hunters of small animals. They moved silently, watched patiently, and could catch mice with remarkable speed. In a place where protecting grain meant protecting survival, cats became extremely valuable members of the community. Over time, Egyptians began to admire these animals not only for their usefulness but also for their graceful and mysterious nature. Cats seemed calm, observant, and almost thoughtful as they watched the world around them. Because of this growing respect, cats eventually became connected to religion and culture. In Egyptian belief, the goddess Batet was often represented as a woman with the head of a cat. She symbolized protection, home, and gentle care. As a result, harming a cat was not only considered cruel, it was seen as deeply disrespectful to the gods themselves. Historical records suggest that laws protecting cats were taken very seriously. If someone intentionally harmed or killed a cat, the punishment could be extremely severe. Even accidents involving cats were treated with great concern. Travelers from other lands who visited Egypt sometimes wrote about how carefully people treated these animals. Some stories even described situations where large groups of people became upset if a cat was injured. Cats were also mourned when they died. Families sometimes shaved their eyebrows as a sign of grief after losing a beloved cat. In certain cases, cats were carefully mummified and buried, just as humans were. Archaeologists have even discovered ancient cemeteries filled with the remains of carefully preserved cats. All of this may seem surprising to modern readers, but in ancient Egypt, cats had become far more than simple animals. They were protectors of food, symbols of spiritual belief, and quiet companions inside the home. And perhaps for one of the first times in human history, an animal was not just tolerated or used for work. It was truly respected and protected by the laws and traditions of an entire civilization. As centuries passed and civilizations grew larger, animals continued to find new places within human society. In the ancient Roman world, dogs became especially familiar companions in everyday life. The Roman Empire was a vast place filled with busy cities, crowded homes, quiet countryside farms, and grand villas belonging to wealthy families. Across all of these settings, dogs could often be found living closely alongside people. Some dogs had very practical jobs. In farms and rural homes, they helped guard livestock and alert families if strangers approached during the night. Their barking served as an early warning system in places where there were no locks, alarms, or electric lights. Other dogs followed hunters into forests and open fields. With their strong noses and quick movements, they helped track animals such as deer, rabbits, and wild birds. Hunting dogs were valued for their skill and loyalty. But not all Roman dogs worked so seriously. Inside many homes, especially in cities like Rome or Pompeii, small companion dogs quietly lived among the family. These animals were not trained to hunt or guard. Instead, they simply shared daily life with their owners. Archaeologists have discovered paintings and mosaics inside Roman houses that clearly show dogs curled up near their owners or walking beside them. Some Roman writings even mention people speaking affectionately about their pets. One famous example comes from the ancient city of Pompeii. On the floor near the entrance of one home, a mosaic shows the image of a dog along with the words, Cave Canem, which means, beware of the dog. The message may have been partly serious, but it also shows how familiar dogs had become in Roman households. Some dogs were treated with surprising care. Wealthy families sometimes fed their dogs special foods and allowed them to sleep indoors. Small lapdogs were especially popular among certain Roman women, who carried them around the home or allowed them to rest on cushions and blankets. There are even ancient gravestones dedicated to beloved dogs. Inscriptions written on these stones describe the animals as loyal companions who brought comfort and happiness to their owners. Of course, not every dog in the Roman world lived such a comfortable life. Many were still working animals or strays wandering the streets of busy cities. Yet the presence of pampered household pets shows something important. By the time of the Roman Empire, the idea of animals as companions, not just workers, had already become a normal part of human life. Dogs were no longer simply creatures living near human settlements. In many Roman homes, they had quietly become members of the household itself. In ancient Greece, daily life often moved at a thoughtful and unhurried pace, especially among scholars and philosophers who spent much of their time discussing ideas about life, nature, and the universe. In these quiet places of learning, gardens, courtyards, and shaded walkways, animals were sometimes present as calm and familiar companions. Greek cities such as Athens were filled with public spaces where philosophers gathered to speak with students. These discussions could last for hours as people slowly walked through open courtyards or sat beneath olive trees. Around these peaceful settings, animals quietly lived their own lives. Dogs were the most common companions. Some dogs wandered freely through the streets and public squares, often becoming familiar to the people who spent their days there. Philosophers and their students might see the same dog resting in the shade day after day, or following groups of people as they moved through the city. While these dogs were not always owned by a specific person, they were often tolerated and even gently cared for by the community. Someone might offer a piece of bread, a bit of leftover food, or simply a kind pat on the head. Cats were less commonly mentioned in Greek writings, but small animals such as birds were sometimes kept inside homes. People enjoyed listening to birds sing or watching them perch quietly in courtyards. For philosophers, animals sometimes served as simple reminders of nature. A calm dog lying nearby during a long conversation did not interrupt the discussion. Instead, its quiet presence often added to the peaceful atmosphere. In a world without constant noise or distraction, these animals blended naturally into daily life. Some philosophers even used animals in their teachings. They would point to the behavior of animals as examples while discussing patience, instinct, or the balance of nature. Observing animals helped people reflect on how living creatures adapted to the world around them. Yet in most cases, the animals themselves remained unaware of these deeper discussions. A dog resting near a group of thinkers was simply enjoying a warm patch of sunlight. A bird singing in a nearby tree was simply following its daily rhythm. Still, their quiet presence left a small mark on the atmosphere of these ancient gatherings. In the calm gardens and stone courtyards of ancient Greece, while ideas about philosophy and knowledge slowly shaped human thought, animals remained nearby, peaceful, patient companions in a world that was learning to observe and understand both nature and itself. As the relationship between humans and animals slowly deepened, something gentle and surprising began to appear in history. In a few ancient places, people started burying their animals with care, creating what we might now call the first pet cemeteries. At first, Animals that died were usually left in the wilderness or buried without much ceremony. But over time, as certain animals became trusted companions, people began to feel a quiet sense of loss when they were gone. In some ancient communities, dogs were buried close to human homes. Archaeologists have discovered small graves where dogs were carefully placed in the ground, sometimes wrapped in cloth or laid in a resting position. These burials suggest that the animals were more than just helpers or guards. They were companions. One of the most remarkable discoveries comes from ancient Egypt, where entire burial areas filled with cats have been uncovered. Many of these cats were carefully preserved through a process known as mummification. Their bodies were wrapped gently and placed in small tombs, showing the deep respect Egyptians had for them. In other parts of the ancient world, small stones were sometimes placed above animal graves. These simple markers may have helped families remember where their beloved animals were resting. Although these burial places were not always large or formal like modern cemeteries, they still carried a quiet meaning. They showed that people had begun to form emotional connections with animals. When a loyal dog or a helpful cat died, some families chose to say goodbye in a thoughtful way rather than simply moving on. These early graves also tell historians something important about the past. They reveal that compassion toward animals is not a modern idea. Even thousands of years ago, people recognized the comfort and companionship animals could bring to their lives. The graves were often small and simple. But beneath the soil, they carried a quiet message: the bond between humans and their animal companions had grown strong enough that it was remembered even after life had ended. As history moved into the long period we now call the Middle Ages, life in many places became centered around small villages. These villages were simple communities made up of wooden homes, narrow dirt paths, fields of crops, and small barns filled with animals. In these quiet settlements, animals were everywhere. Cows, goats, chickens, and sheep were kept mainly for food and farming. But among these working animals, a few creatures slowly took on a different role. Dogs and cats, once again, became the closest companions of village life. Dogs were often seen moving through the village from morning until night. Some followed farmers out into the fields, helping guide animals or watching for strangers approaching the property. Others stayed near homes, resting by doorways or lying beside warm hearth fires during colder evenings. A good dog was highly valued in medieval villages. Not only could it warn families of danger, but it also provided a sense of safety in a time when villages were often surrounded by dark forests and open wilderness. Cats had a quieter but equally important role. Grain was one of the most valuable resources in a medieval village. Families stored wheat, barley, and oats inside barns or wooden storage rooms. But these places often attracted mice and rats that could damage the precious food supply. Cats became natural protectors of these stores. They moved silently through barns and houses, patiently watching for small movements in the shadows. A skilled cat could save a village a great deal of trouble simply by keeping the rodent population under control. Despite their usefulness, medieval pets did not always live the comfortable lives that modern pets enjoy today. Most animals spent a great deal of time outdoors and were expected to find some of their own food. Yet even in these practical circumstances, small moments of companionship existed. Children might play with a village dog while adults worked in the fields. A cat might curl up near a warm fireplace during the evening. Farmers sometimes spoke to their dogs while walking long distances across their land. These simple interactions created quiet bonds between people and animals. In the peaceful rhythm of medieval village life, pets were not usually treated as luxuries or symbols of status. Instead, they were simply part of the everyday world, loyal, watchful companions sharing the same small spaces where people lived, worked, and rested. While village life in the Middle Ages was quiet and open, medieval cities were very different places. Inside tall stone walls, streets were narrow, homes were crowded together, and thousands of people lived very close to one another. With so many people packed into a small area, animals were also everywhere. Dogs wandered through the streets, cats moved silently between buildings, and sometimes larger animals like pigs or goats roamed freely through the city. In fact, many medieval cities looked far less orderly than the towns we know today. Because of this, city leaders slowly began creating rules about animals. Some of these rules were quite unusual. In certain cities, stray dogs were seen as a problem because they could spread disease or cause disturbances. As a result, officials sometimes required dogs to wear simple collars or markings to show they belonged to someone. Dogs without owners might be captured and removed from the streets. Pigs were another surprising challenge. In many medieval cities, pigs were allowed to wander freely, searching for food scraps in the streets. While this helped clean up waste, it could also create chaos. Large pigs could knock people over or block narrow paths. Because of this, some cities eventually passed rules limiting where pigs could roam or requiring them to be kept in enclosed spaces. Cats, however, were often welcomed inside cities. With large amounts of food being stored in markets, warehouses, and homes, rats and mice were constant problems. Cats became valuable protectors of food supplies, quietly hunting pests during the night. Even with these rules, medieval cities still remained lively in somewhat unpredictable places. A person walking through the streets might see a merchant carrying goods, a baker preparing bread, a dog sleeping in the sun, and a cat slipping quietly through a nearby doorway. Animals were simply part of daily life. The strange rules that city leaders created were not meant to remove animals completely. Instead, they were early attempts to manage the shared space between humans and animals in crowded environments. In this busy and often noisy world, people and animals continued learning how to live side by side, sometimes peacefully, sometimes chaotically, but always together within the stone walls of the medieval city. While ordinary people kept animals for work or simple companionship, royal families throughout history often had a very different relationship with their pets. Inside grand palaces and royal courts, animals sometimes lived surprisingly comfortable and luxurious lives. Kings, queens, and emperors were surrounded by servants, large gardens, and beautifully decorated rooms. In these peaceful spaces, pets were often kept not for practical reasons, but for enjoyment and companionship. Small dogs were especially popular among royalty. In many royal courts across Europe and Asia, tiny lapdogs were seen resting on silk cushions or following their owners through palace halls. These dogs were often carefully groomed and fed well, sometimes receiving better treatment than many people living outside the palace walls. Cats were also present in royal households, particularly in places where they were respected for both their elegance and their usefulness in controlling mice within palace storage rooms. Royal pets sometimes appeared in paintings and artwork. Artists who painted kings and queens occasionally included their pets beside them, quietly sitting at their feet or resting nearby. These paintings were meant to show not only the power of the ruler but also the softer side of their personality. Some rulers were known to be very attached to their animals. There are stories of monarchs who traveled with their favorite dogs or birds, refusing to leave them behind when moving between palaces. These animals became familiar sights to the servants and guards who worked in royal courts. In certain cases, pets were even given special sleeping areas, attendants to care for them, and carefully prepared meals. Of course, not every royal pet lived such a peaceful life. Exotic animals were sometimes kept in royal menageries, early collections of rare creatures brought from distant lands. These included animals such as monkeys, peacocks, and other unusual species meant to impress visitors. But the smaller companion animals often lived the most comfortable lives of all. Within the quiet chambers and gardens of royal palaces, these pets spent their days resting in warm sunlight, walking beside their owners, and enjoying a calm existence far removed from the busy lives of ordinary people. In this way, pets became not only companions but also quiet symbols of comfort and personal affection in the lives of some of history's most powerful rulers. During the Middle Ages, far from busy towns and royal courts, many people lived quiet lives inside monasteries. These were peaceful places where monks spent their days praying, studying, working in gardens, and copying books by hand. Monasteries were often built in calm and remote areas, on hills, near forests, or beside quiet rivers. Because of this peaceful setting, animals frequently became part of monastery life. Cats were perhaps the most welcome companions. Inside monastery libraries and storage rooms, monks kept valuable handwritten manuscripts and food supplies. Unfortunately, mice and rats were always nearby, attracted by the warmth and the stored grain. Cats quietly solved this problem. They moved silently through the halls and storerooms, patiently hunting small pests during the night. For this reason, many monasteries happily allowed cats to live within their walls. Dogs were also sometimes present. A friendly dog might guard the monastery entrance or accompany monks as they walked through fields and gardens. These dogs often lived simple but comfortable lives, sharing food scraps and resting in sunny courtyards. Birds occasionally appeared as well. Some monks enjoyed listening to birds sing in monastery gardens. A few even kept small birds inside simple cages near their writing desks, where the gentle sounds added to the peaceful atmosphere. Although monks followed strict rules about discipline and simple living, many historical records show that they still developed quiet affection for these animals. One famous story tells of a monastery cat named Pangurban, known from an old Irish poem written by a monk. In the poem, the monk compares his careful work of writing manuscripts to the cat's patient hunting of mice. Both, he explains, are simply doing the work they know best. These small moments reveal something gentle about monastery life. Even in places devoted to prayer and study, animals were welcome companions. Their quiet presence brought warmth and life to buildings that might otherwise have felt very silent. In the calm gardens, stone halls, and candlelit libraries of monasteries, humans and animals shared a peaceful routine, each going about their daily tasks in the quiet rhythm of medieval life. As towns and cities slowly grew larger over the centuries, markets became important places for everyday life. These markets were usually busy squares where people gathered to buy food, tools, clothing, and animals. At first, animals sold in markets were mostly meant for work or farming. Farmers might bring sheep, goats, chickens, or horses to sell to other villagers. These animals were important for survival and daily labor. But over time, something interesting began to happen. Some animals were brought to markets not only for work, but also for companionship. Small dogs, birds, and sometimes cats began appearing among the stalls. People who enjoyed keeping animals in their homes could now find them more easily in these growing trade centers. The process was still very simple. A person who had raised a litter of puppies might bring them to the market in a small basket. Curious buyers would gather around, looking carefully at the animals. Some might choose a puppy that seemed friendly or calm, while others might simply pick the smallest or most playful one. Bird sellers were also common in certain places. Colorful birds, songbirds, and pigeons were sometimes kept in wooden cages and offered to people who enjoyed hearing their gentle sounds at home. These early pet markets were very different from modern pet stores. There were no official records, no organized breeding programs, and very few rules about how animals should be sold. Most exchanges were simple agreements between people. Yet these markets played an important role in the growing relationship between humans and pets. For the first time, many people could intentionally choose an animal companion rather than simply adopting one that appeared near their home. Slowly, pets became something people could actively seek out. The marketplaces of old towns, filled with voices, carts, and small wooden stalls, became one of the places where the quiet tradition of adopting animal companions continued to grow. For a long time in human history, animals were mainly seen as helpers, workers, or sources of food. Dogs guarded homes, horses pulled carts, and cats protected grain from mice. While many people cared for their animals kindly, there were very few rules about how animals should be treated. But slowly, in different parts of the world, people began to question whether animals deserved a certain level of protection. This idea did not appear suddenly. It grew gradually as societies became more organized and thoughtful about daily life. Some religious teachings encouraged kindness toward animals, suggesting that all living creatures should be treated with care. In a few places, leaders even began introducing simple laws to prevent extreme cruelty. These early rules were not always detailed, but they showed that people were beginning to think differently about animals. Hurting animals unnecessarily, especially animals that served important roles in communities, was sometimes discouraged or punished. In certain European cities during the later medieval and early modern periods, authorities started paying attention to how working animals were treated. Overworking horses or beating animals harshly in public could lead to warnings or small penalties. These were very early steps, but they represented an important shift in thinking. Instead of seeing animals only as tools for human use, some societies began recognizing that animals could suffer and therefore deserved a basic level of care and fairness. Of course, these early protections were limited and not always enforced. Many animals still lived difficult lives, especially those used for heavy labor. Yet the appearance of these first animal protection ideas marked a quiet turning point in history. It showed that the relationship between humans and animals was slowly becoming more compassionate, moving, step by step, toward the idea that animals were not only useful, but also deserving of kindness. Long ago, before modern engines and large steel ships, the world's trade depended on slow-sailing vessels that traveled across oceans and rivers. These ships carried spices, grain, cloth, and many other goods between distant cities. And wherever these ships arrived, lively seaports began to grow. Seaports were busy and noisy places. Sailors moved heavy cargo, merchants counted goods, and ships came and went with the changing winds. Warehouses near the docks were often filled with sacks of grain and food supplies waiting to be shipped across the sea. But these warehouses had a constant problem. Where there was food, there were always rats and mice. These small pests could damage valuable cargo and spread disease. For merchants and sailors, protecting stored goods was extremely important. This is where cats quietly became some of the most useful residents of the port. Cats were natural hunters. They moved silently through dark corners, climbed wooden beams, and waited patiently for the slightest movement. A single cat living in a warehouse could keep many rodents away from the stored food. Because of this, cats were welcomed in many seaports around the world. Sailors sometimes brought cats aboard ships as well. A ship's cat became a familiar member of the crew, walking along the deck, sleeping in warm corners, and occasionally watching the endless waves of the sea. These cats helped control rats during long journeys and kept the ship's food supplies safer. Over time, many port towns became known for their large populations of cats. People working near the docks often fed them small scraps of fish or leftovers from their meals. These cats were not always owned by one person. Instead, they belonged quietly to the harbor itself. Fishermen, merchants, and sailors all recognized them as helpful companions in the busy life of the port. In the warm sunlight of old harbors, cats could often be seen resting on wooden crates, watching ships arrive and depart. Their lives were simple but peaceful, filled with quiet hunting, warm naps, and the gentle rhythm of the sea. In these old seaports, cats became silent guardians of trade, protecting the food and goods that connected distant parts of the world. For many centuries, dogs were known mainly as working animals. They guarded homes, protected livestock, helped during hunts, and sometimes even pulled small carts or carried supplies. In farms, villages, and towns, dogs were valued for the practical help they provided. But over time, something quiet and meaningful began to change. While dogs continued to perform their duties, they also became deeply connected to the families they lived with. A dog might spend the day helping a farmer watch over sheep in the fields, but in the evening it would return home with the family and rest near the fire. These dogs lived two lives at once. They were workers during the day and companions during the quiet hours of home life. Children often grew up playing with the family dog, running beside it through fields or tossing small sticks for it to chase. Farmers sometimes spoke to their dogs while walking long distances across their land. The animals seemed to understand familiar voices and commands, responding with loyalty and enthusiasm. Over many years, people began to recognize that dogs were more than just helpful tools. They showed signs of memory, trust, and even affection toward the humans they lived with. A dog might wait patiently at the door for its owner to return from work. It might bark loudly if a stranger approached the house, showing a clear sense of responsibility toward protecting its family. These small moments slowly changed how people thought about dogs. Even though the animals still had important jobs, they were no longer seen only as workers. They were companions who shared daily life with the people around them. In the quiet rhythm of farms and villages, the bond between humans and dogs continued to grow stronger. Through years of shared work, simple routines, and everyday interactions, dogs had become something much more meaningful. They were not just animals living nearby. They were loyal members of the household. As trade routes slowly connected distant parts of the world, new, and unusual animals began appearing in places where they had never been seen before. Merchants traveling across oceans and deserts sometimes returned with creatures from faraway lands, bringing them to wealthy cities and royal courts. For many people, these animals were fascinating simply because they were rare. In earlier times, most households kept only familiar animals such as dogs, cats, or birds. But as trade expanded during the later medieval and early modern periods, certain wealthy individuals developed a growing curiosity about animals from distant regions. Monkeys were among the most popular exotic pets in some parts of Europe. Travelers brought them from tropical lands, and their playful behavior often attracted attention. People were amused by the way monkeys climbed furniture, examined objects, and copied human actions. Colorful birds also became fashionable among the wealthy. Parrots and other bright birds were admired not only for their beauty but also for their ability to mimic human speech. A talking bird could quickly become the most entertaining creature in a household. In some royal courts, rulers collected even more unusual animals. Small deer, unusual cats, and other rare creatures sometimes appeared in palace gardens or private collections. These animals were often shown to visitors as a way of demonstrating wealth and global connections. Owning such animals became a kind of social curiosity. Guests visiting a wealthy home might be surprised to see a monkey perched on a railing or a brightly colored bird resting in a decorative cage. These unusual pets sparked conversation and amazement among visitors who had never seen such creatures before. Of course, caring for exotic animals was not always easy. Many of these animals came from climates very different from the places where they were kept. Without modern knowledge of animal care, some owners struggled to provide the right food or environment. Still, the fascination remained strong. The growing fashion for exotic pets showed how the relationship between humans and animals was continuing to evolve. People were no longer keeping animals only for work or simple companionship. Sometimes they kept them simply because they were curious about the wider world and the remarkable creatures that lived within it. By the 1800s, during the time often called the Victorian era, the relationship between humans and pets began to change in ways that would shape the modern world. In Britain especially, animals slowly moved from being mostly workers or helpers to becoming true companions inside the home. Cities were growing larger during this time. Factories, railways, and busy streets were becoming part of everyday life. Many people who once lived in rural villages moved into towns and cities for work. As daily life became more crowded and industrial, families began to value small comforts inside their homes. Pets became one of those comforts. Dogs and cats were no longer kept only for guarding houses or catching mice. Instead, they were welcomed into living rooms and family spaces. People began spending time caring for their pets, feeding them regularly, and giving them warm places to sleep. Children often formed close bonds with these animals, treating them almost like playmates. During the Victorian period, something else new also began to appear: organized interest in specific animal breeds. People started paying attention to the appearance and characteristics of their pets. Certain dogs were admired for their long fur, small size, or particular shape of ears. This growing interest eventually led to the creation of dog shows. The first organized dog show in Britain took place in the mid-1800s. At these events, owners proudly displayed their animals while judges carefully examined them. Dogs were compared based on specific traits such as coat color, body shape, and behavior. These shows helped create what we now call breeds. Breeders began carefully selecting animals with certain features and pairing them together so their offspring would share similar traits. Over time, many of the dog breeds that people recognize today were developed during this period. Cats also began gaining more attention. Cat shows eventually appeared as well, where owners proudly presented their well-groomed pets. Another important change during the Victorian era was the growing concern for animal welfare. Organizations began forming to promote kindness toward animals. One of the earliest and most well-known groups was dedicated to preventing cruelty and encouraging people to treat animals with care and respect. These groups raised awareness about proper treatment of pets, working animals, and stray animals. Books and guides about pet care also became more common. People could now read advice on feeding, grooming, and caring for their animals properly. This was very different from earlier centuries when knowledge about animals was passed mostly through everyday experience. Pet shops also began appearing in some cities, making it easier for families to find animals to bring into their homes. All of these changes slowly shaped what we now recognize as modern pet culture. Pets were no longer just useful animals living around human settlements. They had become companions who shared homes, received care and attention, and sometimes even gained a bit of fame at public shows. In the comfortable parlors and quiet streets of Victorian Britain, the idea of pets as beloved members of the family truly began to take root, a tradition that would continue growing in the centuries that followed. As cities grew larger during the 1800s, a new challenge quietly appeared in many towns. Along the busy streets and crowded neighborhoods, increasing numbers of animals were left without homes. Stray dogs wandered through markets and alleyways, while cats searched for food near shops and homes. For a long time, these animals were simply ignored or chased away. But gradually, some people began to feel that something more humane should be done. This concern led to the early creation of animal shelters. The idea behind these shelters was simple but new for the time. Instead of leaving unwanted animals to survive on the streets, special places could be created where they would receive food, care, and sometimes a chance to find a new home. Many of the first shelters were started by groups of people who believed strongly in kindness toward animals. These individuals raised money, found buildings, and organized volunteers who were willing to help care for the animals. Inside these early shelters, life was still quite simple. Dogs were kept in small fenced areas or wooden enclosures, while cats were often housed in separate rooms where they could move around more freely. Workers and volunteers provided food, water, and basic care. They cleaned the spaces where the animals lived and sometimes treated minor injuries or illnesses. One of the most important goals of these shelters was to help animals find new families. People who wanted a pet could visit the shelter and meet the animals there. If they found one they liked, they could take it home and give it a new place to live. This early form of adoption slowly became more common in growing cities. Of course, these first shelters did not have the resources or knowledge that modern animal shelters have today. Space was limited, and caring for many animals at once was difficult. Yet these early efforts represented something meaningful. They showed that society was beginning to take responsibility for animals that had once been ignored. Instead of being treated as unwanted creatures, these animals were now being given care, protection, and sometimes a second chance. In quiet buildings at the edges of busy cities, the idea of animal shelters slowly took shape, creating a new chapter in the long story of how humans care for their animal companions. As more people began adopting animals from shelters or bringing pets into their homes, cities slowly realized that some basic organization was needed. With growing numbers of dogs and cats living in busy neighborhoods, local authorities began creating simple systems to keep track of them. This was the quiet beginning of pet registries. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, some cities introduced small registration programs for dogs. Owners were asked to record their pets with local offices and sometimes pay a small fee. In return, the animal received a tag or small metal plate that could be attached to its collar. These tags helped identify the animal if it became lost. If a dog wandered away from home and was later found, the tag could help authorities return it to its owner. This simple system made it easier to manage animals in crowded cities and reduced the number of strays roaming the streets. At the same time, early shelters began introducing basic adoption rules. Before allowing someone to take an animal home, workers might ask a few questions. They wanted to know if the person had enough space for the pet, whether they understood how to care for it, and if they were prepared to keep the animal for a long time. These questions were simple, but they represented an important change. For the first time, adopting a pet was becoming a responsibility rather than just a casual decision. Shelters wanted to make sure animals were placed in homes where they would be treated kindly and properly cared for. Some cities also introduced rules requiring dogs to wear collars or identification tags whenever they were outside. This helped officials distinguish between owned animals and strays. While these early systems were far less detailed than modern pet registration programs, they were an important step toward responsible pet ownership. They showed that society was beginning to recognize that keeping an animal meant more than simply feeding it. It involved responsibility, care, and a commitment to the animal's well-being. In this way, the quiet development of pet registries and adoption rules helped shape the more organized and thoughtful systems that exist today. During the 19th century, as pets became more common inside family homes, a very special relationship began to grow, especially between children and animals. In many households, a child's first close experience with responsibility and companionship often came through caring for a pet. Dogs were usually the most familiar companions for children. A family dog might follow children through gardens, fields, or quiet streets as they played. These dogs became loyal playmates, happily joining games of running, chasing sticks, or simply resting beside their young owners. Cats also shared many peaceful moments with children. In quieter homes, a cat might curl up beside a child reading a book or sit patiently near the fireplace during the evening. Their calm presence often brought comfort during long winter days or quiet afternoons indoors. For many families, pets were also seen as a way to teach children kindness and responsibility. Parents sometimes encouraged their children to feed the family pet, fill its water bowl, or gently brush its fur. These small tasks helped children learn that animals depended on human care and attention. Stories and books written during the 19th century often included animals as loyal friends of young characters. Writers described dogs that bravely protected children or gentle animals that helped teach important lessons about compassion and loyalty. These stories reflected the growing belief that animals could help shape a child's character. Photographs and paintings from the time sometimes show children sitting beside their pets, holding a puppy, or standing with a dog at their side. These images suggest that the bond between children and animals had already become a familiar and cherished part of family life. Of course, life was still simpler and sometimes more difficult than today. Pets often spent time outdoors, and veterinary care was still limited. Yet even with these differences, the emotional connection between children and their pets was very real. In the quiet homes and gardens of the 19th century, many children formed friendships with animals that they would remember long into adulthood, small but meaningful relationships that showed how deeply pets had become part of human family life. For most of human history, when animals became sick or injured, there was very little that people could do to help them. Farmers and pet owners often relied on simple home remedies or traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Sometimes these treatments worked, but many times animals simply had to recover on their own. As the 18th and 19th centuries passed, however, a new field of knowledge slowly began to develop. People started studying animal health more carefully, leading to the early growth of what we now call veterinary care. The first veterinary schools began appearing in Europe during the late 1700s. These schools were originally created to help care for important working animals such as horses, which were essential for transportation, farming, and military use. Students at these schools learned how to examine animals, understand diseases, and treat injuries more effectively. This was a major step forward compared to the limited knowledge that had existed before. At first, most veterinary care focused on large animals like horses and cattle. These animals were extremely valuable for farming and travel, so keeping them healthy was very important. But gradually, attention began to extend to smaller companion animals as well. As pets became more common in households, especially during the 19th century, people started seeking help when their dogs or cats became ill. Early veterinarians slowly expanded their knowledge to include the care of these animals too. Veterinary clinics were still simple compared to modern hospitals. Equipment was limited, and many treatments were basic. Yet even these early efforts made a meaningful difference. Veterinarians could examine wounds, treat certain infections, and offer advice on how to keep animals healthier. Over time, this growing field helped strengthen the bond between humans and their pets. Instead of accepting illness as unavoidable, people now had someone they could turn to for help. The quiet growth of veterinary care marked another important step in the long history of human-animal relationships. It showed that pets were becoming valued not only as companions but also as lives worth protecting and caring for when they needed help the most. As the love for pets continued to grow during the 19th century, a new and rather curious tradition began to appear in many cities: pet shows. These gatherings were organized events where owners proudly presented their animals to judges and visitors. At first, these shows focused mostly on dogs. People who had carefully raised and cared for their dogs brought them to large halls or outdoor fields, where judges examined them closely. The judges looked at details such as the dog's size, fur, posture, and overall appearance. Dogs that matched certain preferred features were often given awards or ribbons. These events quickly became popular. Families and visitors enjoyed walking through the show areas, seeing many different types of dogs in one place. Some dogs were tall and powerful, while others were tiny lapdogs with long flowing fur. As these shows became more organized, people began creating official descriptions for how certain dogs should look and behave. These descriptions became known as breed standards. Breed standards explained the ideal size, coat color, ear shape, and body structure of a particular breed. Breeders who wanted to raise high-quality animals tried to follow these guidelines carefully. Over time, this process helped shape many of the dog breeds that are familiar today. Cat shows also began appearing not long after dog shows. Owners brought beautifully groomed cats to be judged for their coat patterns, body shape, and calm behavior. For many participants, these shows were not only about competition but also about admiration. People enjoyed celebrating the beauty, uniqueness, and personality of their animals. Of course, not everyone cared about prizes or awards. Many pet owners were simply proud of their animals and happy to share them with others who appreciated them. The rise of pet shows marked another sign that pets had become an important part of human culture. Animals were no longer valued only for the work they performed. They were now admired for their appearance, personality, and the special place they held in the lives of the people who cared for them. As the 20th century slowly began, cities continued to grow larger and more organized. With this growth came a deeper understanding of how animals should be cared for within busy communities. Shelters that had once been small and simple started changing their approach to finding homes for animals. Instead of simply allowing people to take animals freely, shelters began creating more thoughtful adoption systems. Workers at these shelters realized that animals needed stable homes where they would be treated kindly and cared for properly. Because of this, they started asking potential adopters a few basic questions before allowing them to take a pet home. People might be asked whether they had enough space for the animal, whether other pets lived in the house, or if someone would be available to feed and care for the pet each day. These questions helped shelters feel more confident that the animals would be safe and comfortable in their new homes. Adoption also became more organized. Animals arriving at shelters were sometimes given basic health checks. If a dog or cat was sick or injured, workers tried to provide treatment before placing the animal with a new family. This was a big improvement compared to earlier times when many animals were adopted without any medical care at all. Shelters also began keeping simple records. They wrote down information about each animal, including its age, appearance, and sometimes its personality. These records helped match pets with families who might enjoy caring for them. Gradually, the idea of adoption changed in the minds of many people. Instead of purchasing animals from markets or breeders, some families began visiting shelters specifically to give a homeless animal a second chance. This created a more compassionate approach to bringing pets into the home. Public awareness also grew during this time. Posters, community events, and small newspaper advertisements sometimes encouraged people to adopt animals rather than abandon them. These early systems were still modest compared to modern adoption programs, but they laid the foundation for what exists today. Through careful organization and a growing sense of responsibility, shelters slowly created a better path for animals to find loving homes, turning adoption into a thoughtful process rather than a simple transaction. As the 20th century progressed, societies around the world began thinking more seriously about how animals should be treated. For a long time, laws about animals had focused mostly on livestock or working animals. But as pets became common members of households, governments slowly started recognizing that these companions also needed protection. At first, the laws were quite simple. Some cities introduced rules that made it illegal to abandon pets on the streets. Others created penalties for people who intentionally harmed animals. These laws were not always strict at the beginning, but they showed that attitudes toward pets were beginning to change. Governments also started introducing rules about responsible pet ownership. Pet owners were often required to register their dogs, keep them under control in public places, and ensure they did not disturb neighbors. These regulations helped create a balance between allowing people to enjoy pets while keeping cities safe and organized. Animal welfare groups played an important role during this time as well. Organizations dedicated to protecting animals work to educate the public about kindness, proper care, and responsible ownership. They encouraged people to see pets not simply as property, but as living beings that deserve compassion and protection. Veterinary care also became more widely available, making it easier for owners to keep their pets healthy. As pets lived longer and healthier lives, the emotional bond between animals and their families continued to grow stronger. By the middle of the 20th century, many countries had established clearer animal welfare laws. These laws often included rules against cruelty, requirements for basic care, and systems for rescuing animals from harmful situations. While these protections were still developing, they represented an important shift in thinking. Pets were no longer viewed only as useful animals living around human homes. Instead, they were increasingly recognized as companions whose well-being mattered. Through a gradual process of new rules, growing awareness, and changing attitudes, laws slowly began to reflect the special place pets had earned in human lives. Over thousands of years, the relationship between humans and animals has slowly transformed. What began long ago with cautious wolves near ancient campfires gradually grew into something far deeper and more meaningful. In early times, animals were mostly valued for the work they could do. Dogs helped with hunting and guarding, cats protected food from mice, and many other animals supported farming and daily survival. Life was difficult, and animals were important partners in helping people meet their basic needs. But as centuries passed, the connection between humans and animals quietly changed. Dogs that once guarded farms began sleeping inside homes. Cats that hunted in barns started curling up beside fireplaces. Birds that once lived only in forests were welcomed into homes for their songs. Animals were no longer simply workers living nearby. They became companions sharing daily life with the people around them. Families fed them regularly, cared for them when they were sick, and sometimes even mourned them when they were gone. Children grew up forming deep bonds with their pets. Adults found comfort in the quiet presence of a loyal dog or a gentle cat resting nearby after a long day. These animals became part of the emotional life of the household. Modern cities and towns now include veterinary clinics, pet shelters, adoption centers, and parks designed for animals to play. Laws protect pets from cruelty, and many people see their animals not just as possessions but as members of the family. Yet even with all these changes, the connection still carries echoes of its ancient beginnings. A dog wagging its tail at the door still reflects the loyalty of those early animals that once waited patiently near human campfires. A cat watching quietly from a windowsill still carries the instincts of hunters that once protected grain stores in ancient villages. Through thousands of quiet years, humans and animals have learned to live side by side. What started as a cautious partnership slowly became companionship, trust, and affection. And today, in homes across the world, pets continue to share our lives, no longer simply as helpers, but as beloved members of the family who remind us of the long and gentle history we have built together.